I introduce to you now our president, Gerard Schriffen. President Gerard.
Thank you, Andreas, and to everyone, good morning. It's my pleasure to greet you all to a new year, a new year for Rotary, beginning in September 2021. Unfortunately, we had plans to have this breakfast meeting live. It was going to be from the United Nations, but unfortunately, the United Nations is still closed to physical in-person meetings because of the COVID pandemic. We had our guest, Dr. Maria Gazipura, last week, who reminded everyone, and she's an epidemiologist, quite well renowned, and an advisor to the mayor here in New York City, who informed us that if you have not yet gotten the vaccine, if you haven't been vaccinated against COVID, the chances of your getting the Delta variant are excellent, almost certain. So if anyone who is listening has, or you know of anyone who has not yet been vaccinated, please do so for your own good. It's just, this is all too dangerous. This morning, we'd like to welcome Malika Abreu, who is a chair of our International Breakfast Committee at the UN, and also our old brother, our old friend, Francis Dubois. Old in the sense of dear, not necessarily aged, but dear friend. And they will introduce our guest speaker today. So thank you all for joining us. We're looking forward to a time when we can meet in person, hopefully much sooner than later. And we have invited all of our guests, our sister clubs around the world to join with us. They will at least be getting the recording. So I've spoken enough. I'd like to introduce Malika Abreu and Francis Dubois, who will introduce the program this morning. So Malika?
Yes, let me just do my video here. Well, I join President Gerard in welcoming our fellow Rotarians and our esteemed guests and visitors to this monthly breakfast meeting held virtually today. I wish to recognize Francis Dubois, who plays a key role in the organization of our breakfast meetings, and also the contribution of John German, who is chair of the International Service Division of the Rotary Club of New York. As President Gerard said, this session is held virtually. And as they say, every cloud has a silver lining. And because of COVID, we get to extend our audience beyond New York City virtually to include participants from Scandinavia, invited, Europe, North Africa, and here in the US, California, and of course, Dallas, Texas, where our speaker today lives and who I have the pleasure to introduce. Honorable Tatiana Androsov was born in Charleroi, Belgium in the 50s, of parents who had fled the Stalin Soviet Union during World War II. Her father was an engineer, but had to take a mining job to make a living. Tatiana picked up her beautiful French in primary school in Belgium. The family subsequently emigrated to America, where young Tanya blossomed, climbing out of Passaic, New Jersey, the daughter of immigrant factory workers, to a two-year community college, a famous community college, as I should say, followed by Farley Dickinson University and on to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Understanding the true meaning of being thankful for a half-filled glass, she wound up the president of the Thanksgiving Foundation. Tatiana, you agree with me, has clearly lived life at both ends of the spectrum. Throughout this journey, her main preoccupation has been the welfare of her fellow human beings and the planet we all share. Going as far back as the letters to the world that she wrote when she was 12, to the novel she created while while a student, later on as UN interpreter, UNDP and FAO staff member and consultant in Rome and at New York headquarters. And even during countless challenging missions abroad, Tatiana kept writing. Now, quote unquote, retired from the United Nations, she has published some of her work, including Before they Cut the Ivy, about an elite college, just before the Ivy League opened its doors to women. She witnessed all that. She also wrote Mango and Blood, choices. I think she will describe a little bit of the content. But it is always about intercultural, interfaith relationships set in against inequalities, trauma, changing world situation. Having witnessed countless warnings about the future going unheeded, but also having seen what can be done when people come together, Tatiana always looks for the opportunities available to us. For her, many of these opportunities are to be found within the United Nations system. Though an imperfect system with an unusual mix of people, as she says, a motley crew, one which is not well understood, Tatiana is convinced that it deserves much greater support than it has had in the past 75 years. Tatiana, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. I realize that in speaking to the New York City Rotary Club, I am speaking to a group that knows a great deal about the United Nations, more than the vast majority of the general population. You are also among the UN's staunchest supporters. Rotarians have been with the United Nations from its very inception, being advisors to the US delegation at the International San Francisco Conference, which drew up the UN Charter. However, in order to bring up the challenges the UN faces, allow me to go over the simplest things so that those who are following this and do not have your profound knowledge can begin to see. To do that, let me start with what the UN is. The UN is more than the Secretariat, the General Assembly, the Security Council that most have heard about. There are, in fact, over 30 organizations that are part of the UN system. Some are familiar, like the World Health Organization and UNICEF, the World Children's Organization. Others, like ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, or ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, are among those most have never come across. The UN system organizations are not only in New York, they are found in Geneva, Vienna, Nairobi, and other places throughout the world. Guess what the total annual budget of all these organizations is? I'm sure that many of you, some of you, may actually have better figures than I do. However, for comparison, let me point out that the annual budget for New York City for 2022 is $98.7 billion. Getting exact figures for the system is difficult, but it seems to lie somewhere between 60 and 70 billion. Yes, the combined budgets of these institutions is less than the budget of New York City. The US, by the way, provides about 15 billion in assessed as well as voluntary contributions. New York is certainly important, but going back to the Charter of the United Nations And looking at the tasks in the Charter's opening statement, I quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, establish conditions under which justice and respect can be maintained, and promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom." One can see that the tasks are enormous, all encompassing. What kind of budget would the system have to carry them out? Half a century ago, in 1971, as a graduate student of the Institute of International Affairs at Fairleigh Dickinson University, I had the honor of being a part-time speechwriter for Ambassador Xenon Rosidis, then the Dean of the UN's Diplomatic Corps. I wrote a speech for him for the 6th Committee, the International Law Committee of the General Assembly, in which I pointed out that comparing the UN budget to that of the then combined military budgets of the world was like asking children to share a birthday cake once a year while playing at killing each other with toy guns the other 364 days of the year. Guess what? It seems we have improved. The world's total military budget being close to $2 trillion in 2019, that is now only about 30 times as great as the UN system's budget. Thus, the birthday parties at which we all have to be nice and share are now held about once a month. But can we live with that as we face multiple challenges? A growing world population with individually greater material demands, all huddling ever closer in expanding urban areas while dumping wastes in the Earth's oceans and depleting the little planet we all share. Of green spaces, animals, causing nature to revolt with pandemics, climate changes, and disasters. And this planet is the only home the overwhelming majority of us can count us, not only in our lifetimes, but the lifetimes of our children, grandchildren, and their children. Consider that there were about 2.5 billion people in 1950, the time around which I was born. We are now close to 8 billion people, over 3 times as many. However, look at another figure and be astounded. The number of vehicles on this planet, of which there were about 100 million in 1950, has at least risen to over 2 billion. I've also seen other figures that put the number of vehicles at 500 million in 1970 and 3.5 billion now. In any case, those are staggering increases. Consider the impact on our environment. Of course, we are freer or think we are freer because of vehicles, but consider that it is projected that we are going to consume 1/4 of all the energy we have ever consumed in our human history between 2020 and 2030, because by then we are projected to have an additional 1 billion more vehicles. Ponder on what that means for the environment, for global warming, and the consequences of that warming. But let's go back to the UN system and the role it has played. Let us start with predicted calculations. Scientists at the UN in Geneva talked and wrote about large future epidemics in the 1970s, just as they discussed and wrote about desertification, urbanization, and environmental degradation. Note that UN's environmental organization was founded in 1972. The first big UN population conference was held in 1974. I, at the time an interpreter based in UN Geneva, was at that population conference in Bucharest and worked UN environmental conferences, a big one in Nairobi, later in the decade. 1972, for those who might remember, saw the publication of Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome. In fact, those of us in the international community, that is the UN and associated organizations like the Rotary Club, have been talking, writing, and warning about everything that is hitting humanity now. Could we have prevented what is happening? Well, our population only doubled since 1970. It was nearing 4 million then and is about to hit 8 billion now. We would, however, have had as many as 11 billion if we had continued to increase as we had been at that time. So the warnings did have an impact. On the other hand, had the world heeded more, or we in the UN community had made our message heard and understood, we could have had only 6 or so billion with fewer vehicles, more recycling, etc., etc. Because neither happened, we are facing enormous challenges, especially when we consider that in our interconnected world, the local is the global and the global is the local. I don't have to repeat this to you in New York, who've just gone through Ida, an event which, according to historical data, occurs only once in 100 years or more. However, having gone through Sandy less than a decade ago, you know better. Besides, as Rotarians interlinked in the world for peace and human development, you realize that such events are now occurring more and more often. Actually, to be blunt, we get used to catastrophic events. We bemoan them, but if we're not personally subject to them, we go back to our normal lives. I have an example of that, and I almost laugh, because in spite of the coronavirus having filled children's ICUs in Dallas, in spite of another spike in overall cases, the highways in Dallas are back to normal. So congested in the morning, that the morning rush, that cars are crawling, looking like ants on a small screen. You know about the UN Sustainable Goals. Others on this Zoom presentation may not know. Well, they were worked out between 2012 and 2015 and included inputs from civil society. That is, organizations and institutions like yours that are interested in what the UN does and play a part in what it is doing. As a representative of the Thanksgiving Foundation to what is now called the Civil Society Unit of the UN's Department of Global Communications, I was, like some of you, one of the hundreds of thousands who filled in our preferences. Overall, however, too few know that such goals even exist. That is in part because the UN is not a presence in people's lives. Yes, the UN has a web television channel, but the vast majority of people don't even know it is out there. Our local UNA USA club, never very popular, has almost disappeared from view in the last few years, as what are deemed purely local concerns have taken on much greater priority. But now, what is the hope for the future? For that, let me go back in time. How did I, the child of immigrants who worked in factories in Passaic, learn about the UN? Well, in the second half of the 1950s, some of the sessions of the UN were aired on Channel 13, PBS. Alone after school, I was enthralled when I heard and saw Henry Cabot Lodge, our ambassador, the US ambassador, being forceful but civil, polite, as he criticized the Soviet Union's actions. Then I glimpsed as the two ambassadors talked to each other before or after a session. This was no atomic war. Remember those of you who are my age? That was our fear. We even practiced how to protect ourselves in case it happened. We had drills with teachers leading us to windowless parts of halls or getting us under our desks. When I saw the two ambassadors talking, I knew there was hope. The sustainable goals are great. Quite a few of them, for various reasons, including our world pandemic, will not be met by the finish date of 2030. And some of them, carried out in the usual unsustainable manner, will only further contribute to environmental degradation, to climate change, to storms. The pandemic, coupled with the weather events in the last few years, have to make all of us, each one of us, rethink how we live. During the middle of World War II, the Allies, with Churchill and Roosevelt leading, dared think of a United Nations to try to prevent another world war, in spite of many localized conflicts we have so far, in no small part due to the unseen work behind the scenes at the UN, been able to evade a hot, especially a nuclear World War III. Note that the important role of face-to-face behind-the-scenes meetings and talks has been brought out by the UN's decision to hold a hybrid General Assembly this year, in spite of ongoing pandemics. The challenge for us today is to have the minds and hearts to help the United Nations reach more people, create an enlightened public opinion. I took those words from the Rotary website. That makes it easier for us humans to adapt as well as possible to new realities, while at the same time, hopefully prevent or mitigate the worst possible scenarios. It is time for the courageous to stand up and dare point out what is demanded of each one of us, so that we do not go from disaster to disaster each time undoing some progress we have made. As an example, take the world food situation. According to the World Bank, nearly 2.37 billion people, or 30% of the global population, lacked adequate food in 2020, a rise of 320 million in just 1 year, or almost equal to the population of this country, the USA. The situation is even worse this year. How about the regression of countries where people have choices? We are far from the heady days of the 1990s, when it was thought that democracy could be spread far and wide. But how can we help the UN meet present challenges? Can we help it be more present in the lives of the general public, and not just there when something like coronavirus strikes and the head of the World Organization winds up on multiple media outlets telling nations and people that they should send vaccines to other countries? Can we do something so that the head of the World Food Program does not only come on as advertising while one is watching a film on YouTube and plead for donations so that children in X or Z country don't die of hunger? There are some things that could be done. For instance, with weekly half-hour programs on normal media, highlighting what parts of the UN system do. They should include stories of successes as well as needs and failures. They should include interviews of international staff working in challenging places or on cutting-edge programs, and not just diplomats and international leaders speaking from podiums. This can start here in the US with a trial program, for instance, one on PBS. There is a Washington Week in Review. There could be a UN Week in Review. A review might start with about 10 minutes devoted to ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. After all, that organization plays a role every time you and I board a plane. We have something that the World War II generation, which created the UN, did not have: the worldwide communications web. We, all of us, can benefit from it. We need to use it more effectively on behalf of the UN system. Consider for a minute all the stories, series, movies about doctors, policemen, the military circulating over all of our communication systems. Have you seen many stories featuring mid and lower level international civil servants of the UN system and associated non-governmental organizations? Have you seen screen versions of the challenges they face and how they deal with them? It is time for us to have those stories. This is why I wrote and write my novels. A reader said it brought him to real life in the field. But though I can write, what I write is just based on my experience and the experience of those I have known in my international journey. What I would throw out is the idea of having a contest sponsored by some entity outside of the United Nations, calling on present and past international civil servants and consultants, not the top leaders of organizations, to write a short story based on an event, a decision, an undertaking that marked their lives. 77 winning stories could be chosen to come out through a normal outside of the UN media place for the UN 77th anniversary, which, by the way, will take place in 2022. The stories would be diffused by large media companies, a people's salute for the 77th anniversary of the United Nations. Of course, we do see some of the UN's top leadership from time to time. We have a few stories circulating about them, even a movie or two, none well known. We do not hear and see stories about the worker bees who make the system run. People like stories, are moved by them, and learn from them. After all, even our religious books are full of stories. Stories touch people's hearts and spirits. If the peoples of the world, those addressed in a charter, knew more about those who do the daily work of the United Nations system, they would tend to listen just a bit more to what comes out of it. They would probably all push for more support for the system. We managed to avoid a hot world war in part by giving the United Nations about 1/30 of what we give to the military. Perhaps we can lessen the extent of the crises, the challenges that lie before us by providing the UN system with 1/10 of what we provide the military, by knowing more about how the UN really works, by having it be a system that belongs to the peoples of the world through stories of people like them who carry out its daily tasks. You, Rotarians, were among those sowing the seeds of the UN in San Francisco in 1945. UN stories can be seeds for a reinvigorated UN system, one that speaks to the hearts and minds of the peoples of the world, one that meets present and future challenges with deeds and rays of hope.
Thank you, Tanya. Really very convincing. Any questions?
I would like, yes. Thank you very much, Tanya. Your testimony was just wonderful and very appropriate for the Rotary at the UN and for the United Nations. We know each other for many, many years. We work together in Africa. And you are proposing this 77 stories together. And I hope that you will take the lead of that endeavor. And of course, sponsored also by the Rotary Club. I volunteered, I will write one story, and I urge all of you to write, as you said, to bring the UN. Once again, congratulations, Tanya. You did very well, and we were delighted to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really a great presentation. Again,
Thank
very
you.
convincing. Any questions from the audience?
Malika, I think in the chat room there are several questions.
Al?
I did not find questions. I just found greetings in the chat room. I mean,
There's-
that is what the chat room is about, to chat. And
No.
There's one there from Tom McConnon.
Yes.
I see it.
We all know that the United Nations is not perfect. What corrections would you recommend?
Oh, okay. This is something I left out of my speech because I decided that I would only tell us, the people outside of the United Nations, what we can do to help the United Nations.
Yeah.
But one of the things I was thinking about was that what we have sometimes problems in the field. That is that you have many organizations and the UN going in and helping a country or a region, and there is not enough coordination among them so that the help is well divided so that everybody gets to be helped with food or methods of agriculture, whatever the problem. Now, what the UN could do was become an effective, a place where all organizations, whatever they are, whether they're national governmental organizations or not-for-profits like the Rotarians, can come and sit together and discuss and then coordinate among themselves. I don't want the UN to coordinate. I don't really believe in a world organization, a superpower. I believe in international organizations, and the UN is the best one we have as far as I'm concerned. So it could be a place where everybody comes to coordinate among themselves. That should be done more often. For me, that is one of the things that the UN could do, and effectively in the future. And we need it.
Thank you, Tanya. Maybe Francis, do you want to put forward some ideas on the subject, since you have lived through coordinating a group of agencies in Iraq?
Yes, thank you very much. I don't want to speak too much. I was the UN coordinator in Iraq, in Algeria, and Tunisia, and I always said I was coordinating agencies who did not want to be coordinated. So you know, it's like ego. You know, when you invite people to a club, you know, everybody wants to have a piece of the cake, and so we had, to answer Tanya's proposal, we had relations with a non-governmental organization, even and it worked rather well. Again, you mentioned Iraq, and God knows I was under difficult circumstances, but we met with women's association, with the churches and so forth, until the United States and the United Kingdom decided to bring democracy and destroy the country. So this is another subject of state building, which I think we should think about in Rotary. So I agree that we should improve the coordination system. It works rather well. it works rather well. It's, you know, it's like a family. When you invite everybody, you know, for Thanksgiving, around the turkey, for Christmas, for Hanukkah, and whatever, you always have people, you know, who may disagree and may not like it. Anyhow, so I agree with Tanya. We have to improve the coordination, and the UN is working on this. Thank you.
I give the floor to myself now and tell you about my own experience in the field. I was heading the UNICEF office in Ivory Coast, and in an ideal world, the coordinator of all actions in the country should be the government. But the agencies themselves, it is true that some of them did not want to be coordinated by one agency. I think UNDP has been chosen. It also depends on personalities. I know that I was not too keen on having myself on being coordinated by someone else, another agency of the UN system. As for working with NGOs, UNICEF had to work with NGOs. We were doing a lot of capacity building locally and encouraging women NGOs, health NGOs for health, and we relied on them. That's how we were really, that's when we were the most efficient, because the government structures sometimes were very weak. And we did do a lot of capacity building, and the civil society was very, very important for us. Without them, we would not have been able to conduct our projects. So the UN does not, first of all, as you know, all agencies go to a country at the invitation of the government. They have to be, they have to have an accreditation, and we implement, each agency implements a program that is negotiated with the government and signed by the two parties. With, in the case of UNICEF, we look very closely at the budget and at the money we spend there. We have auditors, we have, and the office is held accountable for the funds that are spent in the country. And you know, if the funds are not well spent, it's subject to dismissal on the part of our headquarters. So the funds given to UNICEF are spent very according to a very to a plan that is accepted by the executive board of UNICEF and also by the government. So it's very closely, I mean, the government should coordinate all the actions. Sometimes it is not done properly. And that's why it took a long time to negotiate the fact that now the UNDP representative would coordinate all the other agencies. And I think that it's working. And of course, there are some, well, let me give you an example. In all the agencies had, the chief of each agency had an official car with a flag on it, the UN flag on it. So sometimes at receptions, you had 4 or 5 cars with the UN flag on them, representing each agency. I think that now it is less visible that we go it alone. But you know, the UN is second to none, and whatever its weaknesses, they are always rethinking their strategies. It's a very, very dynamic organization at all levels. And they have the courage to really question their strategies and their
Can I have the word? Can I illustrate something?
Yes, surely.
Okay, what I want to say is when one talks about it, the message does not carry through as much. If you had a story with people incorporated in X country and illustrated this through a story, what you were talking about, and had it as a half hour, an hour television program or any channel or YouTube channel, whatever it is, but not a UN channel. It has to be an outside organization. If people saw through a story how the UN works, they would better understand things. That is the UN's basic problem. You cannot just talk about how it is done. You have to illustrate it in a way that the average person understands. And it is best done through a story. That's my whole reason for stories.
Can I just say, I agree with Tanya, and I want to answer Malika on the coordination. Yes, the coordination's main responsibility lies with the government. The United Nations is present in 153 countries. Most, I'm sorry to be very blunt, and I will not be politically correct, most of those countries' governments are very, very corrupt. And to give money to those governments is unacceptable. This is why the UN is here. And the UN agencies have to monitor such money because it's your tax money. I just want to give an example, Guinea. Guinea is the richest country in Africa with the most important mineral resources, and the people are the poorest. Why? Because of those corrupt, I repeat, corrupt government. So let's not give the coordination to those corrupt governments. I'm sorry, I don't want to give my taxpayers money. I pay taxes in the US and I pay taxes in France. I don't want to give my taxpayers to those corrupt governments. So you said it very well, Malika. UNICEF, like any other agencies, have auditors and are very careful to have very good projects. But the whole thing is this corruption. We could not even use the word at the UN, so we called it good governance. We had a whole program of good governance, and then good governance was not enough. We said state building. You see what we've done in Afghanistan for 20 years with trillions of state building and where we are now. So this is in most countries. So please leave the coordination to the UN coordinator. They're not perfect. I was certainly not perfect. I beat mea culpa. Anyhow, I see that Mr. Francis Limbe has a question and has been waiting very patiently in the chat. Mr. Francis, you have such a beautiful first name. What is your question? We cannot hear you.
Unmute
you.
Unmute yourself.
Okay, hello. Yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm very really thankful for the information, the outlet about the UN. We know that the UN is a big organization. It is very difficult to reform in just a short time. But I just want to talk about the COVID situations, especially in the refugees camps. We are monitoring the situation in northern Uganda, especially the refugees that are coming from southern Sudan to northern Uganda. There's a lot of sexual violations within the camps, especially when the refugees were locked down. They don't have to go somewhere. They're just within the camps. And then at the same time, also the schools is locked down. So there's an increase of the sexual violence, and there's not any alternative because most of them, they stay at home. So what is the solution for the UN to address the increase of the sexual violence, whether in Africa or in other refugee camps around the world?
Well, I think one of these problems have existed throughout history. Whenever we have conflict, we have such problems arise. I think what we have to say to ourselves, we actually have made progress because we now talk about these things and we decry them. That is the first step. We are simply in the probably going towards step number 2. When we start saying that, if we start teaching people before they go anywhere in any country that it is completely unacceptable, this is not the thing to do. When their own governments start teaching them that, when the leaders of fighters, different fighters, say that is unacceptable, then we're going to go to step number 2. But we have to realize that we are dealing with a historic problem that goes back thousands and thousands of years, and one that was not decried the way it is now decried. We have made progress. Don't underestimate the progress we have made. That you are bringing it up, you, a man from Africa, are bringing it up, is already a sign of the progress we have made. So let's find ways to further it, but consider that we have made progress. You are talking about it.
Thank you.
Very good. I think that recognizing that there is a problem is already one step forward. But in all refugee camps all over the world, there is abuse, sexual abuse, but also all kinds of abuses. And it's very difficult to control. You have now, the refugee population has increased all over the world. You have look at Myanmar. How many people have fled, not only the Rohingya, but also other people that don't agree with the government. And Afghanistan is something that's heartbreaking. How many people now have fled or trying to flee their countries. They find themselves in very precarious conditions that lend itself to all kinds of abuse. I served in a country bordering Liberia, in Ivory Coast, which was very rich, by the way, Francis. As you know, they are the first world producer of cocoa and the third world producer of coffee. These crops bring in so much money, and still there is abject poverty that we see every day. So corruption is plaguing a lot of countries, and that's why giving money directly to governments is a big mistake, which, by the way, the UN, there was an appeal for Afghanistan by the Secretary General only a few days ago. The appeal was for $60 million, and we got $100 million to spend through the UN system. And of course, there are NGOs, but the UN system really is there to help these poorest populations, and through its agencies, the UNHCR is doing a great job. I think it's one of the good one of the agencies that yields results. And the other gentleman, Francis Limbe.
Yes.
Are you from that region? From the region you're talking about?
Yes, I'm from Southern Sudan.
It seems that it's a never-ending problem. The more we try to, we think that we have solved the problem of Sudan. They worked so hard to be independent. And once they got independence, they're not doing much with it.
Even though it is the richest country.
Even if it's a very extremely rich country, the underground is full of minerals and strategic strategic stuff there.
And of oil, and of oil. And oil is, of course, the malediction, the curse of those countries. Mr. Francis, you mentioned Uganda. It went to my heart because my very first post with the United Nations was in Uganda when in the early 80s after the departure of Amin Dada. And we had somebody in the, we had what we called then a terrorist in the bush. That was Mr. Museveni. Mr. Weni was hidden in the western part. And then, of course, he took over and has now been a president for 30 years and doesn't want to leave. So this is, again, one of those stories of history. But I keep a very close relationship with Uganda, my very first post. Thank you, Francis.
I wanted to say something on this too, and Francis knows about this. Francis, you know about this. Was in the end of the 1980s, I went with the co-founder of the United Nations Development Program through many countries in Africa, and in order to create a general overview of what could be done. And one of the things we came across was in what was then the Congo, then the Zaire, you know what, at least the Zaire River hasn't changed its names. And we came over to the very end where you had incredible waterfalls. And you had 6 turbines in those waterfalls that could have produced a great deal of of energy that could go on forever and ever, not like energy from petroleum, and could be carried with different lines all over different parts of Africa. We even talked about having part of the energy go to Europe. Now, interestingly enough, those 6 turbines were there. Only 1.5 turbines were working, and nothing has been done yet. It's a giant project that Paul, Mark, and I thought would really bring about renewable energy to all of Africa. It's called Undugu, and Francis knows about it. I have always decried the fact that it was not done. So, example, 6 turbines, only 1.5 working. And by the way, the place right next to the waterfalls did not even have electricity, so they could not show us a program. How's that?
Tanya, may I jump in with a question?
Yes.
So I think I'm going to play devil's advocate on this. I think what you have said and what Malika and Francis just highlighted goes to the very heart of why many Americans have frustration with the United Nations. So as a New Yorker, of course, I mean, members of my family have worked in the United Nations going back to the 50s. We have heard these issues on a daily basis. And Americans say, and as you know, we don't have patience for diplomacy. It's one of our problems. So Americans say things like, my goodness, we discussed this problem 30 years ago. We spent X number of millions or billions of dollars, and we're still discussing it as if nothing has happened. What a waste of our time. Why are we there talking, and nothing is being resolved? So for example, something as simple as trying internally in the United Nations, in the Secretariat, trying to update the computerized systems to bring them into the 21st century. You mean to tell me some little Micronesian country can object to this and hold the entire thing up for years because we need a consensus of all the countries in order just to do something simple like installing a new 21st century computerized system? Total frustration. So what I'm asking you is, any suggestions as to how the United Nations internally can deal with these issues of trying to get progress, results, with all of the time, money, and efforts being put into this?
Well, I know about the problem with computers because I was trying to get the staff rules when I went through the management training program afterwards. I was putting the staff rules into on cards so that they could be on computer. This was way back in the beginning of 1980s. Nothing was done. The problem here again is stories. What we always hear are the negative stories. This is why I think it is so important for us Americans, especially, to have 77 stories, and they should not be all negative because there is so much that has been done. But in story form, people who've lived it, not saying we did this and this and that, but put it in the context of the office, how it was done with the people. So it's a story. The thing is, we only hear the negative things. Yes, there are many negative things. One of the reasons that many things are not done, please consider the budgets of the system. I was told years ago, Paul Mark died in 1998, but Paul Mark told me when the UN started, they had many fewer rules. If something was needed to be done, he, as then the head of the UNDP, just signed a thing, and that was it. And up to a certain amount, everything was done. It was not a big amount, but something that was workable. Now, if people hear the positive stories in story form, if they see it as a program on television, half an hour, I mean, we have things about doctors that are not good. We have things about policemen that are not good, but we have stories about these people on television, on the web, in movies that show us the humanity and the efforts and the successes that these people have. That's what we need from the UN. We need the staff members to put their stories, their big story, in a short form, I would say no more than 5 pages, a story each, not what we did, but with a story form. You know, you walk into the office, this is what you see, you have friends, you have a coffee. Oh, shall we do this? Let's go to the field and see it, a story. There are so many things that have been done. Do not underestimate what has been done. It is hidden because there are no stories that come out. That's why I am for stories coming out. Let's put the UN out there for people to see through the stories that the UN has, positive as well as negative, but positive. We don't hear that.
So you're saying basically this is a public relations issue.
Oh, listen, I am I not only went to Fletcher, I am now I'm having a senior moment. Who is our great, anyway, from the School of Public Diplomacy part of Fletcher. When I was at Fletcher, this is interesting, from 79 to 81, we had 125 students. People were studying security, all these things. We had war games on campus. Only 3 of us, three people were studying public diplomacy. That is the most important thing. We are not getting real stories through. We're not getting successes through. We have to think, for instance, UNICEF, how many children who would not have made it, make it. But you need the story behind the thing, how the child got to be poor, very poor, how they could not be taken care of, how they came to the office, how the office workers at the UNICEF looked at the child. I mean, those are things that touch our hearts and minds. We have to learn to have the United Nations touch the hearts and minds of people.
But Tanya, should this not be, if I may, again, I don't want to belabor the point, should this not be a major issue for the UN agencies themselves? That
no, because
why?
they don't know. It should be done. Listen, one of the things that we have with government, okay, we've had programs about government on television, but the thing is, this is basically, this should not be done by the UN. The UN at this point, let's talk about reality, does not know how to go forward and present itself to the wide world. So we have to help the UN by starting the process. That's all I'm saying. And you know, I'm not saying let's have a program on PBS. I have really concrete ideas that I'm not saying have a program on PBS every day. I'm not saying have the morning show cover a UN story every day. I'm saying start with half an hour the week in review of the UN. We have Washington in review. We should have the UN in review. Very concrete little steps. Then the UN actually would probably learn from that because it would see the effect of having a half-hour program a week, as well as the stories. When the UN sees what happens when UN stories are out there, the people stories, then, and people will be interested again. Let me tell you, in Dallas, it is very hard to have people be interested in the UN because we do not include people stories. I'm the people story of the UN, basically.
In Dallas.
That's right. Only one person.
Now, I want to point out that those stories do exist. The problem is to put them in the media. And this is not being done because we don't control the media. Whoever controls the media has the key. We have, us in UNICEF, negotiated corridors of peace, 3 days of peace to vaccinate children during live conflicts, armed conflicts in El Salvador, in Sudan, Francis. We did that, and we vaccinated children during 3 days. After the vaccinators finished their work, conflict began again. So we the United Nations, eradicated smallpox. I had the honor to meet, and at a Rotary Foundation meeting, the doctor who vaccinated the last smallpox person somewhere in Somalia. So he ended up as director from WHO. He went to PAHO, which is the Pan American Health Organization, because he was from South America. So we do have the success stories. The problem is to put them, to post them somewhere, and they are not accepted because the UN does not have only friends. There are some resolutions at the Security Council that have been passed that don't please some people, and also the problem of mediatization. Of course, we do have the stories. I mean, if you go to the UNICEF site, I can talk about UNICEF site because it's the one I follow all the time. There are hundreds of stories.
But they have to
They exist. They have to be posted somewhere.
Malika, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm proposing a very different proposal. Let's have 77 stories, but not come out of the UN. There are publishing houses in New York. Let's get together and pound at their doors so that they publish the 77 stories of the UN, not little publication companies, but big ones, or get PBS to be interested, get one of these people. I'm willing to go and pound on doors with whoever is willing to come with me to do that. That is very important. You know, you can all read my book Choices. That shows you the good and the bad, and the daily of working in an office. It may have been years and years ago, but it still explains how it's done, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything, and the beautiful. That's why I wrote it. I mean, you know, Choices is really, if you read about it, you are in with the person for a 2-year period in Africa, in a UN office, with what is done, with what is not done, with the hopes, and with the fears, and with everything. I think that that's what we need. We need for people to hear the work that is done by the worker bees. I love the word worker bees. It's a friend of mine at the Thanksgiving Foundation who came up with this. She always said, we are the worker bees, and I adore the worker bees. We cannot, we see the queens, our kings, but we do not see the worker bees. Let's go to the heart with the people who carry out the daily tasks.
And the motley crew.
Yeah, and wonderful motley crew. I will tell you, the one person who is real in my story choices was the sweeper. I left it because he died years ago. Mr. Da, and everything he does in the book is as real as anything. And he is the one who is the glue of the office. And those are stories that that people need to see how things really work. Doesn't have to be the big boss who's the glue. It can be the sweeper. In this case, it was a reality. I put a bit of reality into the story.
That's good. Francis, do you have anything to say on the subject?
I think we have, once again, we thank Tanya, and I think we should pass the floor to our president, Gérard.
Thank you very much. I must say that I've enjoyed this very much this morning, even though we didn't have a chance to have some repast while we're meeting, hopefully soon. Good to see all of you again. Malika, Francis, thank you so very much for your time this morning and your expertise and your insight. And Tanya, it was a treat. Thank you so very much. Along these lines, I just wanted to announce last week, Jan Brown, who's a past president of Rotary Club of New York, and I did a Zoom, and we met with a group of immigration attorneys from the New York State Bar Association and formed a new group. Very quietly, no one knows about it, but we will be working to help the Afghan refugees who are trying to get resettled in the United States. Issues with the SIV papers from the State Department, not easy to find your way through the bureaucracy of the State Department. So here we have a group of volunteers who will start working on this pro bono. And these are one of the things I guess Tanya's talking about, that there are things which do happen that no one knows about. And you have given me some ideas, Tanya, which I'm going to pass on to the board of the Rotary Club of New York, so that perhaps we can be one of these agents that will get these ideas, these stories, and this PR out for the United Nations, where issues can be resolved. And we will call on you.
I'm interrupting you. I was at the Edward R. Murrow School of Public Diplomacy at Fletcher. I mean, who is the greatest example of what can be done? And I'm following in his footsteps, trying for the UN.
Thank you so very much.
Good.
Thank you again, everyone. I would remind everybody that John German, who is the head of our international division, is going to have a meeting directly afterwards. Am I correct, John?
Yes.
All right. So anyone who is interested in participating or being part of John's meeting, please, I assume, just stay online, right, John?
Right. This is our monthly informal meeting of the International Service Division and friends and allies of the Rotary